All right. Thanks, everyone. Michelle had a last minute vet emergency, so she couldn't be here. So I'll be doing the introduction, and it's my pleasure to welcome Andy Hoak here. Andy was at AU as a student, graduated in 1993 with a BA in geology and environmental studies, a double major, right? Some of you are doing that right now. He went on to get a master's in hydrogeology from Clemson University, and he's worked as a hydrogeologist and environmental engineer for, I was going to say over 25 years, but it's apparently 29 years. So pretty soon we'll be able to say 30 years, which will be easier to remember. He works for Dubois and King, a Vermont company, but he opened an office here in Hamburg in the Buffalo area. And I'm very excited to hear about sea lampreys. They're really interesting animals. Okay, I'll give you the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Well, my name is Andy Hoak. I'm a environmental engineer and hydrogeologist with Dubois and King. I've been working as a consulting engineer for my entire career. And I believe this is my fourth trip back to Alfred to present at the Environmental Studies seminar. And it's really great to be back. I always enjoy walking around the campus. It's unfortunate that Michelle's not here. It's always great to see her and reconnect and make new connections with all the students too. So really appreciate you having me. Real pleasure to be here. So the title of my talk is Managing Sea Lamprey Migration in a Complex Geologic Setting. So this is really a story about a project that I've been working on for the past 3 years in conjunction with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And it involves a project located in Champlain, New York, up in the far northeast corner of the state. Basically, sea lamprey have found a way to migrate under a structure that was constructed specifically for sea lamprey control. And the lamprey have managed to navigate under the lamprey control dam through bedrock fractures underneath the dam and resurface at the upstream side. Therefore, basically rendering the whole lamprey control dam ineffective. And this problem has persisted for a number of years, which I'll run through several of these slides. Yep. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. And it's not going forward. Yeah, I'm trying both. There we go. Okay, so first, a few of the basics about sea lamprey. Admittedly, I am not a marine biologist. I am a geologist and environmental scientist, so lamprey are not my specialty, but I know a little bit now, having worked on this project. So just the basics here, we're dealing with an eel or leech type of species. Their scientific name, Petromyzon marinus, translates to rock-sucking fish, native to the Atlantic Ocean, but can be found both on the eastern seaboard of the United States and along Western Europe. They migrate inland along tributaries for spawning, but up until the last 200 years or so, we're limited to the fall line on the coastal regions, where natural waterfall would provide a natural barrier to migration further upstream. Fossil record has told us that lamprey have remained pretty much unchanged for over 300 million years. So these species have been around for quite some time. few of the basics on sea lamprey. There are 4 portions to their life cycle: the egg, larvae, juvenile, and then adult. In the springtime, sea lamprey migrate up inland tributaries where they spawn and lay eggs. That period is about 2 weeks in the springtime. Eggs hatch, and then the small larvae actually burrow into the sediment within the tributaries. It can be sandy material like what you see in this photo here, but I understand that they actually prefer a nutrient-rich, fine sediment, mucky kind of an environment where they can burrow down and sustain themselves on the nutrients within the soil, and then emerge when they get large enough like this to feed off of small invertebrate. They remain in this state for 4 years or longer, just poking themselves out, feeding, growing over those numbers of years. And then finally, after that juvenile cycle is complete, they release from the sediment and then work downstream out to open waters. And that can be either a saltwater environment or a freshwater environment. They can survive and do just fine in either, where they enter into their juvenile cycle. And for those that don't know about sea lamprey, they are meat-eating, blood-sucking animals. So this is somewhat appropriate being around Halloween. They're commonly known as the vampire fish. So during this juvenile cycle, they feast on fish in the open water and then return to the same water, the same tributary where they were spawned to complete their own adult cycle and spawn and reproduce. So here's a nice shot of the underbelly or mouth of the sea lamprey. You can see that they have these sharp horn-shaped teeth, and they actually have a forked tooth, which allows them to adhere or rasp onto fish. Like I said, they are the vampire fish, so they survive on blood and flesh of fish, and that's how they sustain themselves. During that 12 to 18 month period when they're in their juvenile cycle, they can adhere to or rasp onto multiple fish during that cycle. And a fully grown lamprey can destroy or consume up to 40 pounds of fish. So a rather ferocious species indeed. Should mention that sea lamprey it's not a typical fish in that it doesn't contain a bony structure. The entire fish is comprised of cartilage, so it's actually more closely related to a shark than it is an actual eel or fish. It is known to be somewhat of a delicacy. I have never tried it, but I have read stories about it being consumed mostly in Europe. I understand that it's actually pretty close to a red meat. So if you ever have the chance, give it a try. So inland invasion, like I said, sea lamprey are native to Atlantic Ocean, but the onset of the Industrial Revolution and creation of canals has allowed the inland migration of sea lamprey. First, with the creation of the Erie Barge Canal back in the 1800s, sea lamprey were able to migrate further inland up the Hudson along the Barge Canal and access the Finger Lakes and Lake Ontario, where they were contained for about 100 years until the Welland Canal was constructed. Niagara Falls acted as an effective barrier for migration of lamprey up until the 1920s when the Welland Canal was constructed. And at that point, lamprey found a way to work their way through the canal and into the upper Great Lakes, beginning with Lake Erie in 1920, slowly moving up through Huron and Lake Superior through the 1940s. So they've been extremely successful in their migration too, because of course there was an abundance of fish for them to feast upon. No real predators to mention, and have been largely successful in their migration throughout the Great Lakes. So this is a photo of what damage sea lamprey can do. This is an example of rasping. Again, those hooked teeth will latch right onto fish. You can find multiple lamprey on a fish at one time. The process really is a blood-sucking animal, so that they're seeking the blood of the fish, but as you can see in this photo, they do actually bore into the fish too, which ultimately destroys them. One somewhat scary story too, I was a swimmer here at Alfred and have made friends with multiple long-distance swimmers that have attempted lake crossing in Lake Champlain, and I have heard stories of lamprey actually attaching to humans as they're doing long distance swims across the lake. So fortunately, we're able to remove them and you don't end up with anything close to this, but it is a concern and enough to probably scare a few people away from the potential exercise. So the project location, like I said, this is a project been plugged into for about 3 years, working with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. The Lamprey Control Dam is located on the Great Chazy River, which is, I believe, the most northeast river located in New York State. The Canadian border with Quebec is only a mile or two north of this project location. The Great Chazy drains out to Lake Champlain. It's about 6.5 miles downstream from the dam location. So this is just a photo of the dam. I'll give you an overall description of what's happening here. So this is not a traditional dam in that we're not trying to retain flows or create storage. It's called a run-of-the-river dam, which basically just means that any water that's flowing along the Great Chazy is not detained. It's not providing any storage. It just flows right over the dam. But this barrier is tall enough and constructed in a way that is intended to prevent lamprey from crossing over top of it. The dam is around 350 feet long, running across the entire length of the Great Chazy. It includes a sea lamprey trap, which was added a little bit after the original construction. I'll describe that a little bit later on here, but this is the trap that's intended to that U.S. Fish and Wildlife uses as a monitoring point during that spring migration, where they're able to capture the adult lamprey that are migrating upstream. The dam was constructed at this location for a particular reason. There's a flat bedrock surface across the entire Great Chazy, and at this particular location, there's an adjustment in the bedrock elevation such that a natural waterfall once existed at this location, but it was ideal for creation of a lamprey control dam because you could get this extra head with the construction of the dam. At its maximum height, this is only around 6 feet tall, and it's a concrete gravity dam, so it's pinned into the bedrock, so it's not going to move. On the downstream lip of the dam, there's actually a steel flashboard or extension that extends out beyond the actual crest of the dam, which again is intended to prevent lamprey from slithering up and over the dam. But as I described, lamprey have found a way to navigate underneath. I'll get into the bedrock geology in just a minute, but you can see a little bit from this photo that the bedrock geology around here is very blocky and somewhat fractured. I wouldn't say highly fractured, but the fractures that do exist are large enough and extensive enough that lamprey are able to navigate underneath. So a little bit about the dam history. It has an unusual and interesting history. It actually was first constructed back in the 1920s and was intended as a water diversion structure, not a sea lamprey control structure, but a water diversion structure for a frog farm, which before my involvement with this project, I honestly did not even know existed. So water would be diverted from the Great Chazy into several raceways adjacent to the dam, large reservoirs where the frogs would be raised and then collected and shipped off for consumption. Actually, they would be in this location, far northeast New York. You're not too far from Montreal. Frog legs are a preferred delicacy in Montreal, so most of them will get shipped up that way. Yeah. So part of this water diversion was then later converted to be used as the drinking water supply for the town of Champlain. A water intake was constructed adjacent to the dam, which took water and diverted it to the municipal water system. So the actual sea lamprey control dam, as it's constructed right now, was installed in the 1980s. And at least for the first few years, it was somewhat effective, but it didn't take long during this period as US Fish and Wildlife performed their monitoring to realize that lamprey were passing by the control dam. They were finding the species further upstream, and obviously was not serving as an effective barrier. So during the subsequent decade, they developed, New York DEC developed plans for the rehabilitation of the dam. Included the installation of the lamprey trap so they could get more specific information about the numbers that were passing, collect information about the size and health of the species that were located at this location. And there was an extension made to the dam to cut off some small overflow channels adjacent to the dam. So during high water conditions, water would flow into flood chutes, and lamprey were able to navigate up those flood chutes during high water. So 1993, there were some improvements. Unfortunately, even with those improvements, US Fish and Wildlife were still observing upstream migration. So additional repairs were made in 2014. And as you can see, this has been somewhat of a legacy. There was continued lamprey migration beyond that point. So our firm, Du Bois & King, got involved in 2019 with a detailed geologic investigation and engineering designs for additional repairs to the dam. So just an overview of the site plan. I know this is a little bit grainy, but this is the plan that was developed by New York DEC back in the 90s. But this is helpful in just understanding where the various features are located at the site. So obviously we have our actual lamprey control structure, 350 feet across. Includes this kind of bend just so that we have a complete cutoff of the dam over to the old, this was the old easterly dam abutment that was constructed with the frog farm. Improvements that were made in '93 included the lamprey trap right here, the extension to the dam through this section right here. So this was the flood chute where lamprey were able to migrate prior to the 90s. Another prominent feature here is called the mill race. So this was part of the water diversion. It's a man-made channel that was constructed to divert a portion of the water to the frog farm and for the municipal drinking water supply. So water can enter from the Great Chazy into this mill race, pass down a channel that's maybe 10, 15 feet wide to 300 feet long, and then basically reconnects with the Great Chazy further downstream. The water intake for the municipal system located right here. And then just one other thing of note that you'll see in a subsequent slide here, you have an abandoned railroad bed. So cargo rail was passing through the site over the Great Chazy. The old abutments are right here. Continued along the gravel drive that serves residences at this site right now. And this was the location that they were able to load up the frogs for delivery. Okay, just a little bit of the basics on the geologic setting. The project location, I know this image is somewhat fuzzy too, but this is Champlain, New York, right here. You have Lake Champlain through here, the islands of Lake Champlain. This is your border with Canada right here. And our site location is right here, okay? So we have two geologic formations that are of interest. We have the lighter yellow color, which is the Teresa Formation. That's a upper Ordovician, lower Cambrian dolostone. And then the darker orange type color is the Beekmantown group. That's a sandstone, Cambrian age. So slightly older material here. Of interest is right at the project location, you can see we have two thrust faults. In fact, one falling basically right at the project location, right here. This line right here is that rail bed that I just described to you. So you have a thrust fault falling right at the project location. I would say that based on my observations at the site, most of what I was seeing at the surface was more of the Beekmantown group. The geology was such that it was a coarse to medium grained sandstone. Like I said, it would come out in a blocky structure. So you could see downstream and while we were doing work upstream that blocks approximately 3 feet square or about a cubic yard each could be removed manually from the stream bed. Just one other thing of note, was able to experience this back in 2002 while I was living in Vermont, about 80 miles to the east. There was a 5.3 magnitude earthquake that occurred. It was one of the coolest events that I've experienced as a geologist. I was sitting at home having the morning coffee with my wife, and it sounded like a fleet of helicopters flying overhead. Not just one, a fleet. And it was just amazing. The air just vibrated and sounded just like a helicopter. And had never experienced an earthquake before, but I knew that that was what was going on. I ran outside, put my ear to the ground, and it was just so cool. But I mentioned that because there have been and there will continue to be events just like that in this area. It's not a particularly active seismic region, but there is a history of earthquakes in the area, and we should expect that geologic conditions will continue to change at the site. So whatever remedial efforts we make right now are certainly not forever. We can expect that things will continue to erode, continue to adjust, And this may be a long-term maintenance type of item at this site. So our work began in 2019, and we performed a geophysical investigation, which included a ground penetrating radar survey, or GPR survey, of the eastern portion of the dam, and also dye tracer testing, trying to establish hydraulic connections between the upstream portion of the dam and the downstream portion. So you can see in this photo here, part of that work included installation of temporary flashboards along the top of the dam to prevent flow from going over top of the dam, so that we could get a somewhat dry surface on the downstream portion to run our GPR equipment. And if you haven't seen a GPR survey before, it's this instrument right here. I have another photo with a close-up of that, but basically you're running an instrument across the bedrock surface. Signal is sent down, penetrates into the bedrock, is able to identify fractures, whether they be water bearing or just open voids. And that reading comes back to us instantaneously on a screen on that instrument. So we're able to identify location, relative size, and orientation of the fractures. So in this case, we did identify 2 areas along the eastern abutment, which would be this concrete structure right here, horizontal fractures positioned 4 to 7 feet below ground surface. And that included a portion of the survey that was done up on this grassy segment off of the dam, and also immediately adjacent to the abutment in this area. So depths ranged from 4 to 7 feet. We also identified a horizontal fracture about 2 feet below the surface, the bedrock surface on the downstream side of the dam. This all makes very intuitive sense to me, because as you look at the picture here, you can see that we have a natural step in the bedrock surface right here. Like I said, this was a natural waterfall to begin with before the dam was placed. And what you're seeing right here, that 2 feet, the fracture located 2 feet below surface on the downstream of the dam, is basically this surface that you're looking at, the natural water surface at the time that this photo was taken. And that corresponds to the 4 to 7 feet that was observed along the eastern embankment. So it was clear that this was the zone that we were concerned with. A few other observations and conclusions from the 2019 investigation. With the GPR, we were able to establish a vertical fracture zone about 80 feet north of the eastern abutment, right near this bend in the dam. And then also with the use of our dye tracer, which we applied on the upstream side of the dam, right here, we observed that dye tracer passing through and surfacing on the downstream side of the Lamprey trap. So it was clear just from this initial investigation that we did have hydraulic connection, we did have identified fracture zones, and obviously we knew that Lamprey were passing through, but the real intent of the investigation was to try to pinpoint where those fractures existed so that we could develop a mitigation plan. The mobilization and permitting and approvals that are associated with just performing this investigation takes some time. There are multiple parties involved in this structure. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers are involved and have an interest in this. New York DEC owns the dam. The town of Champlain and their water intake had a vested interest in this. You had adjacent residential owners. So all of this required, time to get approvals, notification. The process just takes time. So we were limited in performing our investigation to the eastern side of the dam in 2019. One other critical item that we were looking at in 2019 included what we called the chimney. And that's this cement block, concrete block, and improvements that were made as part of the 2014 rehabilitation attempt at the dam. So you can see right here, this is under the condition where we have our flashboards up. There's no water or very little water passing over the dam during this period. Yet you can see in this photo, we have a strong upward hydrostatic condition existing at this chimney location. Water is boiling up at this spot. And we know that the water's got to be originating somewhere further upstream, but we haven't identified it yet with our GPR survey. We did attempt dye tracer test immediately upstream of the dam, right adjacent to where this boil is occurring, thinking that, well, we're at the closest location. It's got to be the shortest flow path. Obviously, this has got to be the location. No dice. There was no hydraulic connection at that location. So we knew that at this point, that we had more work to do, because this was the strongest hydraulic connection that we could observe at the dam. So we continued our work into the following year, 2020. And in order to completely characterize the dam and identify all the bedrock fractures, we basically did the same scope of work on the west side of the dam. Installed these temporary flashboards, prevented flow from going over the west side of the dam, and performed GPR survey and dye tracer test. We didn't find nearly as much on the west side of the dam. There was, again, horizontal fractures that were identified kind of at the midpoint around in this area, again, around 6 feet below. So I think we're talking about the same bedding plane that I identified in the year prior. And we did dye tracer test. But at this particular location where we found the horizontal fracture zone, again, the dye tracer test was inconclusive. There was no hydraulic connection from immediately upstream of the dam to downstream. We did, however, perform a dye tracer test at the chimney location. So this required further investigation. We attempted multiple locations upstream, trying to find where the water was entering into the subsurface and exiting at this location. Leading up to our investigation, of course, we had plenty of conversations with U.S. Fish and Wildlife. They had shared with us that during that 2014 timeframe when they were working on the dam, that they identified locations within the mill race where they could observe the bottom of that channel being a little bit different than the rest of the locations. There was gravel subbase. There was visual movement of the water within the channel, and they had made prior attempts to arrest the lamprey migration by laying down geotextile fabric on the bottom of the channel and anchoring that down, so that if lamprey were indeed navigating and exiting at that location, that hopefully the fabric would prevent them from making their way upstream. Well, we did apply the dye tracer test in the mill race, and we were able to establish that connection. So now we know where the fractures are. We've got a strong hydraulic connection from the mill race to this location, and that allowed us to start developing a mitigation plan. So here, just a summary and overview of what we're looking at. Again, the shaded areas, your blue and green areas were the vertical fractures located at the right abutment. Here's the vertical fracture about 80 feet north of the eastern abutment. You have your additional horizontal fracture located on the western side of the dam. You've got the hydraulic connection on the east side of the Lamprey trap that was verified through dye tracer testing, and then the connection from the mill race down to the chimney location here. Didn't mention this when we were talking about the geology, but the bedrock fracture orientation was almost dead north-south and east-west, which kind of makes sense if we're looking at that thrust fault that was basically oriented north-south. And I gotta say that the primary fracture orientation that I was seeing once the bedrock was uncovered was primarily north-south. So the connection here between the mill race and the chimney seemed to make sense. So working with US Fish and Wildlife and Army Corps, we researched methods that have been employed previously. Was recommended to us to follow the US Army Corps of Engineer guidance document, this EM 1110 document. So not that this document was created specifically for lamprey control, but has been used successfully at other dams where leakage, seepage, bedrock fractures were concerned. So this procedure that US Army Corps had developed was intended for the installation of grout holes and creating an effective cutoff wall within the bedrock fracture network. So our plan included installation of multiple 3-inch diameter holes drilling down into the bedrock in the pattern that you see here. We have spacing of 5 feet between holes, drilled down 10 to 20 feet. So we want to make sure that we're well past that identified fracture zone at 6 feet, and then staggering the holes about 2.5 feet apart. Now, there is a certain procedure that you want to follow when you're filling the grout holes, right? Because you don't want to fill them all at once. You want to make sure that you're getting complete distribution of the grout and filling all the fractures. So you actually fill every other hole to begin with. And then you come back and fill the holes in between. And then the idea here is that you're able to fill all the fractures with your first attempt. And then by coming back and doing the holes in between, you're able to verify whether or not you're actually getting complete filling and creation of a cutoff wall. In addition, we know that the bedrocks were oriented more or less horizontally along that bedrock depositional plane and vertically. So you don't want to drill a hole straight down because either you're on the fracture or you're not on the fracture. So you actually want to add a little bit of a batter or an incline to your drill hole so that you're more likely to intercept a fracture as you're drilling it versus just straight down. So we had a 10 to 15 degree batter on our holes. So this was our initial layout for the holes just along the eastern abutment. There were other sections of the dam that continued around this bend so that we had a full distribution of holes right up to the eastern side of the Lamprey trap. Here's a few photos of the holes being installed and the grouting taking place. So this was a track mounted drill rig, air percussion drill rig with just a carbide tip. You're able to advance the 10 to 20 foot hole in a matter of 10 to 20 minutes. Really doesn't take that long to drill the holes. You can see the batter that's placed on the drill head there, a slight incline that's positioned perpendicular to the expected flow path of water over the dam. And then the grouting itself. So what we did, this was just a regular cementitious grout that was mixed on site. We would pump into the hole first and just allow gravity conditions for the grout to infiltrate into the hole. Typically, the weight of the grout, of course, is going to displace water. It's going to settle over time. And we would then return to the hole, half hour later or so. By that time, the grout will have settled. We would add more grout in. So we want to make sure that we're getting complete distribution. And then we would return a third time with this little contraption here. So there's an actual inflatable bladder that's inserted into the 3-inch hole. You fill up that bladder, create a seal, and then there's a bypass pipe that goes through the bladder. You can load your grout into this little hopper, and then there's a hand pump right here where you're cranking up the pressure, pumping the grout in. You can achieve, maybe a 10 PSI type of pressure. But again, the whole idea is that we're pushing and distributing the grout into those fine fractures and trying to fill it in so lamprey cannot find a way through. So I think there's a little video here just of the drilling, not that it's, oh, I'm sorry, next slide. So a couple of photos here. Obviously, with any field investigation, you always need to make modifications. It's never exactly what you expect it's going to be, So as we ran through our initial plan of the grout hole layout and filled those holes, we learned more. We found that there were fracture locations nearby where we could see water bubbling out. We could see locations on the downstream side where grout was breaking through into the Shazy, all of which is telling us that we haven't cut the flow off completely yet. So it necessitated us to propose additional holes and expand our array of drilling so that we had a complete cutoff around the entire dam. So just something to expect when you're entering into a field program where you just don't have all the information. You're going to need to modify and adjust along the way. And that was exactly what we needed to do here. Okay, now I think this is the video of the drilling. Not that this is overly exciting, but you can just get an idea of what's happening. Oh, that's not playing. Okay, well, you're not missing an awful lot. All right, so all said, we ended up with around 120 holes that were drilled, all along the eastern side. I mentioned that we had identified a fracture zone on the western side of the dam. We've decided to forego that location because it would have required a whole remobilization to the site, installation of a large Cofferdam, all the added expense, and the evidence just wasn't there that one particular location on the west side of the dam was a particular problem. So we decided to focus all of our efforts on the eastern side of the dam. So this is ongoing work. All the drilling and grouting was done in 2021, and now this past spring of 2022, U.S. Fish and Wildlife was able to conduct their springtime monitoring during the adult migration upstream. And initial results suggest that we've obtained some success here, that in the years leading up to this point, they were able to collect a few dozen lamprey in the trap per year. This past spring, they collected well over 1,000. So it appears that the work that we've done has been very successful. And I wish that was, the end of the presentation. I could just say, oh yeah, success, we did a great job, let's move on to the next job. But that's not the case. With one problem solved, there's always another problem that comes up. And that's exactly what happened here. Our successes at the dam led to other problems at the site. During our work, we didn't attempt to seal the fractures that were identified in the mill race. Those holes were still open. And although we were able to cut off the flow path of the water passing underneath the dam, water found another flow path. It found another way. And it resurfaced at the adjacent residential property and flooded out their yard. So water was now diverting underground through the bedrock fractures, not flowing underneath the dam, but to another portion of the property and flooding his lot. So it's possible that water was flowing through bedrock fractures. It might have been passing through old pipes that were left behind from the frog farm operation. Could have just been flowing preferentially along the side of those pipes. We don't know, but we have a problem and we got to solve it because the neighbor is not happy. Here you can see, some of the dye in one of the raceways associated with the old frog farm. Everything's all rotted out. I mean, these pipes are 100 years old, so we don't know what the condition is. They're all galvanized steel, so I'm sure they're rotted out completely. So that was the spring of 22. Over the summer, we started working on a new design. The neighbor fortunately had this old hand-drawn diagram of the frog farm, and it showed us the location of some of the old piping network and helped us figure out, maybe what we were dealing with here. And what you see in the photo, I just highlighted sections of some of the old piping. This used to be the intake for the frog farm, piping that ran to a junction box here, continued on to some valving, and then discharged into the raceways where the frogs were raised in this area. So we had a general idea of where the pipes were. We knew that we had created a cutoff wall here with our holes and grouting. So, and we know that there are fractures within the mill race that are now, instead of flowing this way to the Great Chazy, are following other fractures, probably along that north-south, east-west fracture zone, and entering into this pipe network or voids that are located in this vicinity. So we were able to get an emergency approval from DEC and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to install a temporary earthen cofferdam, basically just cutting off all flow from the Great Chazy River into the mill race and just drying the channel up so that water was not able to infiltrate those fractures and make their way to the neighbor's property, while we got an opportunity to just step back and figure out what the next step was going to be. So that's been in place since, I want to say, December of last year. This past spring and summer, we developed a new engineering plan to prevent migration of water to the neighbor's property. Very similar to the temporary earthen cofferdam. We had conditions placed on us by DEC and the Army Corps. Excuse me. They insisted that we create a natural type of barrier within the mill race. We couldn't install a concrete weir across the mouth of the channel. We could not use riprap stone. It was very important to them that whatever we created, that it was compatible with the environment at the location. It needed to appear as if no work had been done. Basically, we come in, we create some sort of barrier that would be undetectable to those visiting. So our solution was really threefold. We create another earthen weir structure that prevents flow from entering the mill race, but we have specific elevations that need to be maintained. The height of the mill race cannot go any higher than the ordinary high water within the Great Chazy River, meaning that any storm event that's around the 2-year event or less would all flow over the Lamprey control dam. Anything larger than a 2-year storm would still be able to access the mill race. So you would expect occasional flows within the mill race. And that was something that the landowner was able to live with. So we found a compromise. In addition to that, we put together an engineered logjam. So there's actually a science behind this. You identify certain species of wood based on the density of the wood, the length of the members that are used, the way that the timbers are intertwined, how they ballast against each other. Again, this was something that I was unfamiliar with leading up to this project. So we have an engineered logjam at the mouth of the mill race, which is prevented to protect the earthen embankment from ice flows, debris flow, and to somewhat slow the flow that's passing over the earthen embankment. And in addition to that, I mentioned before that U.S. Fish and Wildlife had placed geotextile fabric on the bottom of the mill race. Well, that's being done here too. That throughout the entire length of the mill race, there were 2 layers of a woven geotextile that were laid directly onto the bedrock surface and then covered with the natural stream bed sediments. We returned those back into the channel so that, again, you would never know that we were ever there. So hopefully that will provide if in the event that Lamprey find another pathway around the dam and into the mill race and upstream along the Great Chazy, that filter fabric is kind of our last line of defense. And again, in most circumstances, that mill race will be dry. So unless you had a coincident event where you have high flows during spring migration, fills the mill race, and somehow that water level is above the earthen weir embankment here, it should prove to be an effective cutoff. So here are a couple photos of the exposed bedrock within the mill race. Lo and behold, we had a major fracture running right along it, east-west orientation, just like I was talking about. The locations where we saw the gravel subbase within the channel lined up perfectly where the fracture was lining. The contractors here did an excellent job of cleaning up the surface, removing debris. This was a lot of hard, meticulous handwork of getting all the crud out of the fractures, but gave us some excellent information. There was a void that we identified at this location, 9 feet deep and ran 25 feet long right here. So plenty of room for the lamprey to live and migrate. So our work here involved physical removal of some of the more highly fractured zones. We took out some of the larger blocks just so that we could then fill this entire fracture zone with plain concrete. Originally, our plan was, we were envisioning holes within the mill race, an isolated fracture zone where we could do something very similar to what we did at the dam, where we could inject grout at a specific location and fill the void from that specific location. Once this was all uncovered and we knew that we were dealing with a much larger fracture network, we knew we had to switch gears, which is why we made the switch to a plain concrete installation. So no reinforcement, we're just dumping concrete into the fracture, filling the void, and trying to fill those fractures so lamprey can't get through, and also to hopefully slow any water flow to the neighbor's property. Wanted to mention too that at this particular location where this big fracture was located under the surface, we were seeing interconnection from this location down here. As we were moving blocks of bedrock at this location, the fracture was filled right here, and you could see the water level just rising and falling. So we knew that everything was interconnected here. Also, surprisingly, when we had this all cleaned up, I don't have a good photo of this, but we found evidence of some other prior attempt to fill this fracture. So when it was all cleaned up, there was a thin layer of concrete placed in the fracture already. So maybe at the time that the frog farm was constructed, or when the municipal water diversion was installed. Someone else made a prior attempt like this, but it was just a thin veneer of concrete and it wasn't effective. Once this was uncovered, of course, the concrete was weathered. We were able to just bang it away. It wasn't doing anything for us at that time. Yep, I'm almost done here. So here's just some photos of filling of the fractures. Again, just dumping in plain concrete. As we were doing this, we were able to see water flowing out from the other side. Clearly, a connection right here. So conclusions. Our attempts at grouting and creating a cutoff wall at the Whiteside Dam and creating a barrier for sea lamprey migration appears to be effective, at least from this preliminary monitoring that was done in 2022. Although we won't know the true effectiveness of the work that we've done for many years to come. Like I said, things will adjust, things will move. There's a long life cycle associated with the late sea lamprey. So we're going to need to go through several life cycles with the lamprey to really truly know whether or not that the work that we've done has been effective at cutting off migration upstream. And with the ultimate goal of slowing and limiting spawning upstream. Our real goal is to see more of fish like this in Lake Champlain. This was a new state record holder, I think close to 20 pounds that was caught in 2019. So you can see nice clean fish here, no rasping, and we want to see more of that out in the lake. And that's it. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Some of you might have to run the class. How deep is the rasping?
They're about an inch in diameter. Well, that particular photo was maybe the worst that I saw. I haven't actually seen one in person, but just the photos that I've reviewed, most of them were surface related.
And above the screen, are there trout or salmon?
No. So it's also an effective barrier for, yeah,
So you're
trout.
prevent breeding areas so that
Right. So currently, they apply lampricide in the fall, every fall. And the closest location where they can do that effectively, they need to find, river crossings where the lampricide can be applied across the full width of the river is an additional 12 miles upstream. So this will, hopefully cut off that segment.
it's called lampricide. And it's rare that you can find something that's so specific. But because lampreys are so far removed evolutionarily from most fish that they were able to identify that evolutionary.
Yep.
So we'll let folks go and maybe hear the questions. Thanks again.
Thanks for coming. Really appreciate it.